Friday, pre-Halloween Friday afternoon. I'm Claudio Lomnitz of the Anthropology Department here at Columbia University and the Center for Mexican Studies. And I'm delighted to introduce Benjamin Mayer and to open up this rather innovative event that Benjamin has concocted for us. Benjamin is a well-known cultural figure throughout Latin America and elsewhere, and certainly in Mexico. He's a psychoanalyst, a philosopher, and a critic, who's especially known both for the kinds of innovations that we're going to be discussing this afternoon to do with pedagogy, writing, critical reflection, and critique of education, critique, I would say, of institutions, including broadly of the state, but specifically of education institutions, but also his explorations into the senses and aesthetics in the senses, in particular work that he's done on blind photography in the blind, work that he's done with performance and music in the deaf community in Mexico, and perhaps more broadly works to do with the connection between the senses, aesthetics, and social life. We're here. Benjamin is here at Columbia, has been here at Columbia for the past 6 or 7 weeks as an O'Gorman Fellow, which alas is a program that is on its way out, a program that was co-funded by Columbia and CONACYT, but whose funding is sadly right now. We hope one day that it will be renewed. But the spirit of that fellowship is for researchers, artists from Mexico to come to Columbia and to New York, and for relatively short stays, 4 to 8 week stays, in order to develop their work, have a chance, a little bit of a timeout from the sort of grating of the day-to-day in various Mexican cities. In Mexico City, very often, or in Guadalajara, Monterrey, provincial cities, and to come to New York and have a little bit of freedom. And apparently he's been using his freedom, I've been told, to lock himself up in his room to write, which is a little bit sad, but also kind of heartening in its own way. And really, we're really very delighted that he's been able to make the best of the time here, both to write and then to circulate quite amply. He's going to be talking to us about the innovative institution that is now turning 20. So this is a sort of 20th birthday that we're celebrating of 17, which is a kind of a networked educational and cultural institution that sort of recognizes cultural production in some way as being intrinsically connected to something like exile, but also it recognizes exile as being a form of connection and not just a form of isolation. The philosophy of 17, as far as I've been able to witness firsthand, has had as one of its pillars writing, and all of the students who come to do programs there and the various intellectuals who are connected to it are generally connected through writing projects. In the sense, there's a tradition of reflection that is connected to the development of particularly creative projects that's quite notable. And the second I would say is for a kind of, I'm not sure whether Benjamin would agree with it, but a kind of philosophical and critical philosophical penchant in the creation all around. So it's a sort of an educational and a cultural space that we really need to, I think, pay attention to and help foster and strengthen as far as we're able. And in particular, in the light of the decline of public support for the humanities and for the qualitative social sciences. So which sadly has been a process, an ongoing kind of decline, at least in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, of public support for these disciplines, so that the importance of networks that are really standing aside, not against necessarily, but at least alongside, adjacent to, parasitical whenever possible, independent whenever is necessary. This kind of art is something that Benjamin has fashioned actually and has put into practice as a kind of collective project for already 20 years. And in this sense, I'm really proud to have him here and feel privileged to have the opportunity to discuss what this project is, what it has been for Benjamin specifically, but generally for the collective that has been connected to it over the years. So without more ado, Benjamin, welcome.
Thank you so much for such a warm and clear welcome. I've actually spent the last 20 years locked up, so it's not only no, it's been wonderful to be here. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity, and I thank you, Claudio, for having provoked the original visit that then opened up this longer stay. It has really really had its effects in terms of not only allowing one to contemplate one's own work at a distance, but also actually to be out and about quite a bit and talk to other people. And also it has a certain, it feels, I say this sometimes, it feels like a certain coming out of the project after 20 years. So we've been like quite intensely working on it for all this time. In fact, the actual 20-year anniversary was back in 2001. But this is something of a celebration beyond our immediate context in Mexico. And it certainly has been incredibly stimulating to talk about the project and to share perspectives about it and about all these other problems that we're facing within and without the university that somehow concern the project in various ways. So I want to say how grateful I am to all those colleagues and friends out there who connected via Zoom. It's really a privilege having you here for the conversation. And I will then get going with the presentation that I did concoct, and it's probably trying to say too many things at the same time. It's a very wide, diverse community that I've brought together through the invitations. It's people from many different fields, and part of the effort really is to get going some sort of Esperanto effects, whereby we can somehow find a way of sharing perspectives and finding a certain vocabulary to do this, as you will now see. So first of all, it's really inevitable to refer to the situation that we've all gone through in this last period. I got two identical letters from Colombia, 3 different years apart from each other. They say, yes, come, and these are the dates, and for the government fellowship, and I was sort of all ready for it. The second time, which is of course this one, it finally happened. And we all have a feeling that many things have changed. It's not that things were that great before, but there is this distinct feeling that many things have maybe radicalized or intensified in various ways. And there's a running joke among us. In January 2020, we threw this colloquium called Cómo surge un nuevo orden, which is how does a new order emerge? And of course, this was immediately before the pandemic. So our friend Conrado Tostado, who curated this conference and sort of, suggested having it in the first place, really was onto something, we feel. We had the pleasure of working with Christoph Holzai and Manuel Granellati, who may be connected, so I wanted to thank them and mention this. And curiously also, we organized this conference with the Colegio Nacional, of which Claudio then became a member. And I'm not mentioning this only to congratulate him again, but I do think that, as I've said to him, that his work being done from there is very important, and I think he's making a very distinct use of the tribune, which is unusual in our context. It's a much more sort of forward and robust use of the Colegio Nacional Tribune than we've seen before, dealing with themes that I will touch very briefly on, but you'll see what an important place they occupy in my reflection as well. And this, of course, has to do with the war on organized crime, if there is such a war, not only in Mexico, but worldwide. So I really want to thank Claudio for making this occasion possible, as I said, and also Victoria Murillo, Nara Milanich, Esteban Andrade, Ana Lopeza, Ana Cárdenas, and of course Conacit, and I hope they do think again about closing down the government program, which is so important to freshen up when one is too busy with one's own things in a place like Mexico City. Okay, so I want to start by giving you a very brief sense of where this comes from in terms of my own personal and personal history. I come from a couple of families who were emigres to Mexico. They were all German Jewish, further back. My father's family came from England, basically, after Germany, and my mother was a direct exile. She arrived in 1941. My grandfather was already a psychoanalyst in Frankfurt, left Germany very early in 1933. And this has a certain oblique relation to what I will later mention. So the presence of the Spanish Republican exiles has always been very important for intellectual and cultural life in Mexico. And it was also the case in my own personal history. And I ran into a particular experience that they brought with them, which was pedagogy developed by French educator Célestin Reinet, which is actually writing based. It basically emphasizes the importance of writing in school settings and writing, through sending letters from one school to the other, and then editing these lovely small little books and having the kids print out with mobile types these small booklets. I never heard anything too convincing about why, in fact, we were doing this at the time, but retroactively, it actually became much more important to me. I would also cite the presence of Ivan Illich and Sidok, which is a particular center that he sustained in 1970s Cuernavaca, where Eric Fromm and Mendes Arceo, liberation theology and psychoanalysis, by the way, all converged in various interesting and provocative ways. Then came the wave of the Southern Cone exiles from Chile, from Argentina, from elsewhere, many of which I grew up with. And I tried to mention a few authors that are cited on my presentation that somehow create something of an atmosphere for me, which I think provides a substratum for what will come afterwards. Also very importantly for me, there's jazz, which is of course well known to you here in New York, and specifically a fascination with free jazz and with improvisation that will then take a sort of importance of its own. So I came across the thought of Jacques Derrida around 1989, 1990, thanks to Jeff Bennington, who I'm extremely grateful for having, given me such a fantastic introduction to Derrida at the time. And then, even though my grandfather was a psychoanalyst originally, and he went on to work in the field of group analysis, I didn't get involved with psychoanalysis personally until after that, which is curious in most sequences. That's what I meant to say, till 1991. So this is something of a background to what then took the form of this coming across the work of blind photographers. At the time, I was meant to teach theory at a school of design, and graphic designers really couldn't care less about what I was supposed to teach them. And I was very sort of mystified about how it is that they found it so useless and so boring. So one day I went to the cinema and I found this amazing character, this blind man who takes photos to find out whether his mother is lying to him about something. So he would show these photos to his close friend and say, what you see, and then confront both versions with what his mom had to say. So I went back to the classroom and said, well, from now on, you're going to design for blind people. So all my students looked at me like heads, like eyes wide open. And they said, that's impossible. And I said, why would it be impossible? So basically, the experience that took place after that had to do with disengaging the visible from design, using blindness as a sort of knife, if you want, to differentiate those two things. And I was so enthusiastic about this that I went to the sort of director of the school and said, listen, we should introduce blind people to this school to be able to do this kind of work more. And she said, it sounds interesting, but you're crazy. So I said, okay, fair enough. So I left and then came back with a Spanish magazine, El Paseante, that contained at the time the work of this absolutely fabulous Slovenian blind photographer called Eugene Baucha, who was named official photographer in Paris Photography Month in 1988. And that, of course, made him very well known. You can see some of his work here. You can look him up. There's much more to be seen for the internet. So what somehow emerged through this work was, in fact, the sense that blindness, this factor which was somehow missing, or apparently missing, from the perspective of those who are later called those who are blind to their own blindness. You know, my students who were so resistant to working with blindness. In fact, they thought they could see fully, and there was no reason why they would have to engage with blindness as such, or with theory, which is in fact a way of getting across one's own blindness of sorts. So blindness became something of a wild card that allowed me to bring lots of factors together that were in unusual combinations. And it also allowed, in very compact ways, to talk about things which theoretically would easily become quite complex, right? Philosophy and so on. This was already at a time when I was becoming involved more and more seriously with psychoanalysis as such. And the impact of many of the events that we organized at the time, exhibitions and roundtables and publications, and it actually became such a large operation that it left this trace in Mexico, enough for it to be possible to write about blind photography in Mexico. Like there's like generations, there's like various applications, very different styles of approaching the matter, some of which I didn't agree with at all, but it actually became quite a big thing. One might even say that Mexico is a blind photography powerhouse, which is a sort of a funny type of a statement, but it's true. There are many blind photographers there elsewhere. It's a growing movement worldwide, and it has, I think, many interesting things to offer. Then I was already involved in a program dedicated to semiotics that I had founded in a private Catholic, very limited university. And I was working away at my own analysis. And I came across this phrase that I said, which basically posited the possibility of installing or setting off, building a silence-producing machine, which you can see has this curious similarity to the logic of the blind photographer, right? The silence corresponds to the blindness, and the very productive work that the blind photographer actually did and still does can be equated to the machine. So a few contextual references here. This is the end of the 90s. There were, in my context, many discussions raging about the relation of psychoanalysis, deconstruction, the university, feminism, historicity, you know, what kind of a structure might be important or feasible, you know, to be able to bring all these things together, since the university already then seems sort of a clumsy place for all of that, and certainly for psychoanalysis. Here are some colleagues, some authors that I was close to at the time: Frida Sal, Marcelo Pasternak, Raimundo Mier, Marta Lamas, y Ensemble. It's the time of the beginning of Revista Fractal, which is emblematic of that period. I think 1995 was its beginning. And then there was the question of what the relation might be to critique of Mexican culture as a whole, which is, of course, an enormous question. But I have we in fact have a common friend with Claudio Philippe Olela Quinn, who's who's an essay writer, a Frenchman who decided to settle in Mexico and build many editorial bridges between Mexico and France and Spanish and French. And he wrote a very small, compact, very provocative book, which basically says there are 5 critical writers in the whole of the literary Mexican tradition, right? You can count them with one hand. All the rest is basically work which is sort of very cozy with the powers of the state and the you know, the sort of salon type culture, which is more about social relations and about really engaging more critically, more profoundly with a critique of what has to be questioned in the Mexican context. So this was a consideration. I was always very attentive to the destinies of the Collège International de Philosophie, founded by Derrida, a project which has since basically sort of decayed. I don't know how to describe this in appropriate terms. But of course, it was originally associated to the French state, right, which is a problem. And there's a very interesting discussion by Max Weber already in the turn of the century, 1910, about the unique importance that critique should not be housed in universities associated strongly with the state. So the autonomy of critique, and you can hear the resonances here of Kant with regard to philosophy and the university and the place of all of this in society, is something that in fact concerns many of these other references that I mentioned. So anyway, I decided to call this silence producing machine 17 Instituto de Estudios Críticos. That happened in 2002. Our first activity took place in 2001, but that name was not yet fully established. And in fact, it's a reference to number 17 of Victoria Alley in Frankfurt, which is the place where the Institute for Social Research was housed. But what is less known is that they opened up in their own premises rooms for psychoanalysis to be practiced, not only theorized, but actually put into practice in Frankfurt. So number 17 names this very unusual link between the critical and the clinical, between social critique and clinical praxis. And it turns out that my grandfather, my mother's father, was the first director of that clinical setting as an analyst. And in fact, he was able to save himself and his family because he was well aware of what the hell was going on in Germany at the time, and therefore was, lucky enough to be able to leave in 1933 and to be able to talk to his friend Horkheimer at the time and find confirmation for his own decision and his intuitions. Now, sometimes we get this thing said to us that, in fact, this is all very well, but in the Mexican context, this is a bit Eurocentric, like what's all this German stuff, and what about, the local traditions and so on. So to begin unpacking that, which of course would take a bit longer than we have today, I'd like to mention that, in fact, the founder of the Frankfurt School was a guy from Argentina called Felix Weil. Now, Felix Weil is the way the Germans have published his name. His full name is Felix Lucio José Weil, which any Spanish speaker recognizes immediately as a completely castizo, fully Spanish-speaking name. And it's not that he was only born there. He actually founded, he supported the foundation of the Frankfurt School, and then returned to Argentina, became an important public intellectual there, had public positions in the government and so on. So he was a full-fledged Argentinian public figure. So it's not so easy to say that this was Eurocentric and immediately alien to what would happen in many other parts of the world. So, as you might imagine, by calling the institute un instituto, there was already a sort of tongue-in-cheek effect with regard to the famous Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which is the main party that presided over the Mexican 20th century. We all talk to each other in Mexico as licenciados, we're very institutional, and so in the institution it had to be. But then I was already interested in the relation between deconstruction and cantinfleo, which is a bit hard to explain in English if you haven't come across cantinflas. It's a way of speaking gibberish and not saying apparently anything, but in fact coming across in various, in fact, quite fundamental ways in MC. Then cantinflas as a character and as an actor got caught up in the mainstream political system in Mexico. And so he became institutional in his own way and institutionalized. And yet, I think there's an importance in recovering the original energy of cantinfleo as a critical, very corrosive and very interesting substance. So the first person to open his mouth in an event organized by us was in fact Carlos Monsiváis, who was a very important intellectual figure and an ironist, a very funny guy who said very funny things in public about awful things that went on, but always had the sort of panache to sort of crack the right joke at the right moment around lots of things that were happening over many years in Mexico. The first event we organized was actually called a Theologies. This name was taken from Mark C. Taylor's work. I wanted to mention this Mark if you're here, because it was actually very important, and you'll see what place the atheological takes later on. This was just a few weeks, just about 2 or 3 weeks before 9/11. So our history has been marked by 9/11 to begin with, and well, we're down to the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So what kind of a period can we, sort of define this as? Then there was a war on drugs, which was in fact a war against the narco in Mexico, and then a very long, intense process of transition, which was supposed to take us to democracy, and has in fact derived into a scenario which is very much more complex, as I think one might be able to say is the case elsewhere. Okay, so this is actually a preamble. I'm going to try to not make this very long. The next part turns into sort of Chinese, so it's a bit like it can be a bit daunting, but you can sort of imagine that we're drawing these diagrams on the serviette in a cafe, and we're just talking over these things. So I slowly tried to formalize these things more and more. I was, of course, very influenced by deconstruction, and I became more and more influenced by Lacanian psychoanalysis. And I started to use Lacan's 4 discourses as a language in which to try to formalize what it is I was after. So the idea is that there are basically 4 types of social bonds, according to Lacan, around 1969, 1970. So there's basically religion, art, science, and his unique proposal at the time was that psychoanalysis could be conceived as a kind of social bond. So it wasn't simply a therapy, it was not simply a method in the Freudian sense, but it was actually a kind of social practice, which could be usefully compared and contrasted with religion, science, and arts, to be defined in very, very precise terms, as you can see from these diagrams. Now, to cut a long story short, the interesting question is perhaps what happens when capitalism comes into the scene. So what is capitalism? Is capitalism a religion? Is it art? Is it science? I mean, what the hell is this thing? And Lacan's sort of tentative proposal, he only talks about this in a few sessions in his seminar without fully developing this, which is quite interesting. There was a sort of a dithering about his theoretical development. Is that in fact, capitalism is a mutation of the discourse of the master, which is originally a description of religion and the political in the classical sense. So to describe it briefly, capitalism is about putting the subjects in the position of the master. So that the driver becomes a subject instead of, let's say, for example, God or the king. So this is quite straightforward, really, I think by now. This is the ascent of the bourgeois subject, in power. Now, what's interesting about this is that the discourse of capitalism, this 5th discourse, in fact, does away with the very carefully constructed grammar that governs the operation of the previous 4 discourses. So I sort of wanted to push this over and open Pandora's box for you and think about this. So this is really a question about how many forms of sociality can there be in these terms? Like, if sociality, as Lacan proposed, is basically made up of a web of relations of power, knowledge, subjectivity, and a residue that does not fit in any of those previous categories. It's neither to do with power, nor to do with knowledge, nor to do with subjectivity, but it's sort of things out of place all the time, which is famously the position that Freud accords to the unconscious. It's sort of neither here nor there. We don't know if it's scientific. I mean, like, how the hell do you talk to it? Or, I mean, does it talk back at you? Or, what is it? Is it dead? Is it alive? It's this very sort of ambiguous sort of thing. So this is what I mean by the residual. So the question is, does capitalism deregulate social relations to the extent that, in fact, new and many more forms of social relating are possible? One is, of course, humbled to talk about this in the presence of not only one, but 2 anthropologists in the room. It would be fascinating, and this comparison, this double perspective between the psychoanalytic and the anthropological has always been fascinating. I'm thinking here of the relation that Lacan had to Lévi-Strauss, among many other things. So I started to sort of dabble with these 24 discourses And I began to see that one could do different things with them. One could describe contemporary forms of discursivity that were somehow parallel to this mutation that Lacan suggested was an explanation behind this passage from the discourse of the masculine to the discourse of the capitalist. And then I got this idea that hasn't left me ever since, which is that deconstruction can be thought of as a particular type of social thought. So deconstruction is not, in this description, about thought. It's not philosophy. Derrida left this very, very clear. It's neither philosophy nor method. Paul Deman famously says, deconstruction is something that texts do to themselves. It's not something that one does to them. And therefore, it's somehow an inherent dynamic to the very workings, let us say, of the symbolic and the imaginary. So I try to frame this problem in terms of thinking that deconstruction could be written out in this Lacanian vocabulary. It's been, of course, very hard for me to talk about all this for these many years. So I've written reports to kind of cantinfleo to do so, which is what I'm trying to do right now. But the point is that to get to a condensed description of what this might mean, deconstructive discourse is very close to analytic discourse, which we know well enough. The difference is, as André Green famously expresses at the beginning of a seminar by Derrida called Freud and the Scene of Writing, that deconstruction can be thought about as a psychoanalysis of philosophy. So not a psychoanalysis of subjects, but a psychoanalysis of, let's say, of knowledge itself. So it seems to me that that's actually an interesting sort of shorthand description of what we're talking about. And as you can see, there are two variants that very simply derive from this combinatory that I'm here writing out. And there are two variants. The first variant is a subject producing deconstruction, subjetivante, and the other variant is an institution producing variant, which is instituyente. And what is instituting the instituting effects of this dynamic has to do basically with the possibility of a deconstructed generation of new signifiers, to use the old 60s, 70s vocabulary that Lacan uses here. In other words, to bring this discussion closer to home, deconstruction is not simply about making things relative, which is what we're used to thinking about. It's also about being able to establish new references that are somehow sort of tainted by the process that has given birth to them. So there's actually a technical name for these. Rodolphe Gachet, Derrida's colleague, proposed these to be called quasi-transcendentals. So these new signifiers are not theological, they are atheological. That's the point. They're already marked by a certain negativity on account of the deconstructive process that has given forth to them. So I went on and over the years, I've thought about, all of these variations. I'm not over with them at all. I suppose I'll end up writing something of an I Ching, and you can. So I thought about, I just wanted to mention them. The first one I want to mention is that of trafficking, tráficos, which is actually thinking about social bonds that in fact account in their grammar for basically the kind of criminal behavior and relations that we see all over the world, taking over more formal forms of exchange and accountability within the legal system and the economic system. I think that should be thought about seriously in social and symbolic terms, to understand, what it is that we are sort of in the midst of. And if I give a shorthand definition of that, it's a sort of perverse appropriation of the residual. It's the residual gone ori, that residue that is so productive analytically, deconstructively, and also infrapolitically. This is an aside for Alberto Moreiras, who's been an important interlocutor and a theoretical presence over many years for me and for the project. This residual, this sort of substance that doesn't find an abode neither here nor there, can be, of course, used in this perverse sort of way. And you have basically the social bond of trafficking or tráficos. All this one, of course, would be what one can talk endlessly about all this. So, what about the Institute? So the Institute is basically patterned on these two forms of social bonding. And the Institute visibly, I wanted to call this talk field notes, deriving from this 2-decade experience at the Institute of Critical Studies. So this is the field. This is a field where the field notes have been taken. And the field is visibly an institute which is legally constituted, it's accredited, it has a formal existence, it has an autonomy. It began doing consultancy for itself in order to bring itself to existence. It then started out with this colloquium with Carlos Monsiváis in 2001. We started with extension courses in 2003. We then launched the first postgraduate programs in critical theory in Mexico and perhaps in Spanish, I'm not sure, in 2006. These programs were set to operate online already in 2006, which was a big taboo. Everyone thought this was crazy and very unbecoming for programming in the critical humanities. So the typing machine, the máquina de escribir that we've been working on during all these over 15 years now, in fact creates this community of, I call them escribidores in Spanish, maybe the good translation is scriveners. So the main form of communication in this social fabric which is floating in cyberspace, is the written word. And the effect is very, very powerful. It's powerful both on personal terms for people involved in the process, and collectively, it's quite funny when we come together, you can actually hear people sort of listening out for the commas and the semicolons, when usually people in discussions in Mexico and elsewhere, in Latin America, famously interrupt each other all the time, right? So after you sort of see people in this sort of writerly elements, it actually completely changes the nature of interaction and of even verbal exchanges, of course, and so then there's the editorial work, there's some online radio, there's a Center for Advanced Studies that we're trying to really get going to the work at the highest level within this general perspective. So if this is the field, what is what are the fruits that we might be able to report? So I have a list here, which is rather long. Basically, I wanted to share with you a few annotations, taking into account in particular the kinds of interests that I know motivate many of our dear guests, both here and on Zoom. So, of course, the first thing is the actual, this was, of course, a whole crazy project. My friends say, it sounds great, Benjamin, good luck, tell us how it is, we'll bring a broom to be able to pick up the pieces when you're over. So, first of all, the great thing is that it actually works. It's self-sustaining economically. I don't think it would be able to sustain itself if it weren't for the libidinal effects that it has as a dynamic. So we've had support from the state and from private hands and from foundations sometimes for particular projects, but I was very hard-headed to make sure that there was no artificial sort of economy that sustained this sort of then fictitious experiment. So the experiment is really self-sustaining and such, and I think that already said something. Then there's a whole archive of the experience of the students, which is a massive archive. I won't be able to go into this. So we've basically been practicing critical theory, understood as this double movement of deconstruction as social bonds in these two variants. The psychoanalytic has been practiced in a way which is very, very close to writing, and from a certain grammatological point of view. I would underline the artistic sort of markers. Perhaps, as you might imagine, our interest is essentially describable as that of art that is animated by a certain poetic sort of distance. So you have the blind photographer, you have this fantastic Brazilian artist called Edic, who's worked on the representation of the written in plastic terms. It's fantastic. And we were able to offer a doctoral honorary degree not only to our dear friend the blind photographer, but also to Evelyn Glennie, who is actually the main and most important percussionist in the classical music circuit. And our interest, of course, had to do with the fact that in fact she's deeply deaf. And therefore, it's not only about Boucher's genius or Glennie's genius, quote unquote, but really it's something much more powerful going on around the logic of deafness and music, percussion in this case, and blindness and the image. So there's again this sense that the lack can, of course, shed a lot of light in all kinds of different scenarios. So with my dear Beatriz, present here, we've worked over many, many years on matters of disability, which are, of course, very closely related, as you can see, to this logic. She also heads our work in the field of health. We held colloquium on health systems and the health of the system, which is an interesting tension. And I could multiply the examples here. What I basically want to underline, this is not simply a catalog of themes or projects that we're undertaking. The point is that the only interesting reason from the point of view of what I'm talking about, the only interesting reason to embark on them has been to put into play this double logic that I'm calling deconstruction as social bonds, subjetivante, instituyente, and see in fact how far this can take us. And what I can say, as you can see from the list, is that it actually takes you very, very far. I don't think we found an edge that is the sort of final sort of station for this possible journey. We know from both from Derrida's and Lacan's works that there is no end to the span that they can reach, even though the problems may be new every time. I will say just two things with particular people in mind. The first is that the atheological component was something important not only as a theme and as a discussion at a time when, in fact, in public discourse in Mexico, there really was a debate about the proper place for religion in public affairs. But in fact, the atheological reference really has to do with the nature of the community that needs to be formed in order to sustain the project. And of course, it would make absolutely no sense for the community to be theological or to be religious or political in Lacan's original terms, or indeed to be simply academic, scientific, or artistic for that matter. So you need to mold what the sorts of social interactions at play need to be in order for the project to be properly consistent with its own terms of reference and its own ethic, if you want. One way of describing this would be to make an oblique reference to Hermann Hesse's Glass-Bead game. Maybe some of you know it. And to imagine a glass-bead game played via negativa, not by this sort of elitist, full of themselves players who really think that they've reached absolute knowledge, which is of course the sort of exact contrary to what we're talking about, but actually gamers or players who will be in a position to work with the negativity that's actually the very spring of the project in itself, put into this strange performative sort of mode that the Institute has actually mobilized. The other reference I will make has to do with something which is coming up. We of course have published lots of things, and all these things have exciting reasons behind them. So there's all the traces that have to do not only with our editorial work, but with the projects themselves proposed and developed by the students that I won't be able to go into right now. Okay, so what is happening at present? After many years, of thinking about our economic dilemmas and the massive sort of challenges that a project like this faces, if it doesn't want to simply sell out and, or fund itself through subsidies or any other of the usual means. After the quake in Mexico in 2017, we developed a platform that I would show you in a moment, that basically belongs to the wider context of let me just escape me this, these crowdfunding platforms. So it's a sort of a crowdfunding platform, but it doesn't simply crowdfund. Because of course in Mexico and in Latin America, crowdfunding doesn't work as easily as it is supposed to in North America and in Europe, because we don't as easily express our political views or our cultural preferences by, throwing money at something. What we do to get something going is basically throw a party. We will throw a party, we will create a community, and on that basis, we will solve the problems that will emerge after that. So this is basically a party throwing platform. That's a joke, but you get the idea. It's basically a platform to bring together communities of interest and of desire, you might say, around particular initiatives. So that if I'm worried about stray dogs in large cities, I am bound to find many other people who are worried about the same problem, not only locally, but globally, right? So I will pitch my project to the platform and people will raise their hands and say, yes, this is awful, we must do something about it. So the projects will evolve into, what you have and what you need. So I have an idea, or I have an idea and these resources, but I'm missing this other part and so on. So actually the platform, which is about to begin its work, will actually create conditions for these convergent groups to come together. So again, it's about bringing together, it's about creating social bonds. So we're back at square one, right? There's also a social network included, so that people get to know to each other, and there's an online commercial exchange where people can put their produce offered to others online and so on. Now, the only last comment I want to add about this is that once you produce these small communities, you also build a community of these communities, right? So there's an overarching community that is slowly formed, and that community is called the critical ensemble. And I hope that the critical ensemble will actually grow much more than the Institute has grown up to now, that the Institute will become a part of it alongside many other projects, and that this might be an avenue to strengthen the social and economic capabilities of our immediate communities of reference, i.e. the academic, the cultural, and the social sectors that are so underfunded in Mexico, in Latin America, and elsewhere. Okay, so just as coming up to the end, there is a very important formulation that Derrida developed, which is published under the name of the University Without Condition. So recently, a few months ago, Nestor Bramstein, who actually finalized his life just when I arrived in New York 2 months ago, and wrote a very moving letter, basically defending the right of people to end their lives when it was right for them. And this is obviously a controversial and very important, I think, recent development. He was at a colloquium in June with us, and he said, well, you know, about 17 and you've called it a post-university, Benjamin, which is fair enough, but you know, nowadays we've got post-truth as well, so post-university doesn't really sound that good, he said to me. So really, it's time to accept that what is really at stake is this idea of Derrida's university without condition. Now, if you know that book, and I heartily recommend it, you will see how Braunstein had a very clear case for his arguments. But at the same time, I would say that conceiving deconstruction as a social bond, in fact, allows us to go beyond the gates of the university, even as an institution. So when you read this manifesto by Derrida, The University Without Condition, which he first spoke about in 1998 in California, and then published in 2001 in French, and 2002 it appeared in Spanish. So these are the exact years you can see in which the Institute itself developed. When you measure the distance, the historical and contextual distance between ourselves and those times, I think overall that one is more worried about today, about the very conditions of possibility of the university. Never mind it being with or without condition afterwards. One is worried about the conditions of possibility in terms of work and the nature of work nowadays and economic activity. One is concerned due to some personal and subjective reasons, the general well-being of subjects at this time. One is worried about the weakening of the public sphere, with all sorts of legal and other concerns to do with corruption and so on. The digital is, of course, less rosy picture than it was then. We were all enthusiastic and utopian about the possibilities of the internet and so on, and Derrida was as well. So we have a bit of a darker light on all of that today. And of course, there's a massive fundamental environmental question. So basically, the comments I want to make pretty much to end this is that one of the advantages of conceiving of deconstruction as a social bond and not in terms of this idea of the university without condition as concerns the university. I mean, we know that many other of Derrida's works lead in all kinds of different directions. But I think one of the strengths of conceiving of deconstruction as a social bond is that it allows to work beyond the university and allows us to tend for the very conditions of possibility of this idea of the university without condition, which is basically having a social guarantee of a space where it might be possible to talk about anything at all in any terms which might be deemed appropriate at a certain time by someone, and that the right to it is called free research, radically free research in this sense, and radically free taking of a voice in public is actually related explicitly by Derrida to the right to free association in the secularity system. So we can see how this relates to so many of the very sort of worrying debates about democracy that we have these days. Okay, the idea really, and this is why it's so fantastic to be here in New York to open up this discussion, is once this archipelago of sorts has been formed and consists of an institute and of a critical ensemble, which somehow we hope will provide a compatible form of supporting in material terms the various initiatives and the various projects that are associated to this dispositif. What might be the ways of thinking about its future, and what might we be able to do that is interesting and worthwhile enough with an apparatus that has begun to grow not only in Mexico and Central America, by the way, but also in the Andean region, in the Southern Cone, in the Iberian Peninsula, and in places like Sao Paulo, and eventually in places like New York or elsewhere, not only on account of this occasion, but other things as well. And what might be the form that is appropriate for such an organization to take? It might be, for example, steward-owned public interest company, which is independent from the state, and I'm referring back to Max Weber here. So this is really simply to put the ball in the middle of the field and ask people, well, what would you do? What would you suggest? Why might this be important for us? How might this be useful even beyond Latin America? And that's really the question I've been trying to get at in my conversation at this time, and this is what I want to end with as well. Now, I didn't show you the platform because I was worried that if I opened the web page, I would mess up the presentation. Perhaps Anna, you can help me.
Yeah.
But anyway, over to you. This is a privilege talking to you, and thank you for your patience. It's long. Sorry. Maybe it's temporarily down something. It won't take long to get back up, but we can try.
Well, thank you, first of all, for that really exciting, and kind of eye-opening. I don't know how to call it, sort of trip, wandering, but at the same time full of, let's say, relevant vistas. Tour that you've given us. Do you want to just? Do you want to? I know that you have a number of guests via Zoom. Do you want to field questions from them first, or shall we start talking here?
Maybe we can start talking, then we can invite them into the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I certainly have a bunch of things, but do you want to open?
As you wish.
Well, let me get started then. I wanted to hear more. Well, first, I thought it's very inspiring, and I do hope that that we can continue to to add on to and get involved in this kind of gestalt that you've generated. I think it's extremely inspiring. I wanted to hear a little bit about the question of silence and silence producing machine, because to me the production of silence, as I heard it in your presentation, is essential maybe as in order to generate, let's say, the yin space or the negative space out of which creation is possible. I don't know whether I heard that right, but that's how I imagined it. But at the same time, one always thinks, for example, of the state, which is a noise-producing machine, right? If ever there was one, but a noise-producing machine that has famously, especially in authoritarian contexts like traditionally those of Mexico, generated silence, right? One thinks of all of the, so many books about Tlatelolco and all that have silence as their core trope. So silence can be a sort of isolating thing, but the notion of the machine seems, of course, more collective. And so I wanted to get your sense of that, and maybe the tension between, maybe this question goes to helping you elucidate for me the relationship between deconstruction as a subjectification or subjectifying kind of a bond versus an instituting kind of bond. I'm not sure whether this relates, but I wanted to hear a little bit more from you specifically on how it is that you see the production of silence as part of your collective practice.
Yeah, well, the first sense that you mentioned is it in terms of this step back that allows you then to step forward and to have this respite, like a 2-month sabbatical that will then, it's that exact idea. The blind photographer has many descriptions of how the oversaturation of images, of course, leaves you sort of dazed, metaphorically blinded. And so when we use our sights on a daily basis, we need to wink, right? And that wink is exactly what we're talking about when you talk about the silence needed or the breathing needed to be able to keep on talking. Now, why must this be produced? And I think the response is fairly straightforward. I mean, there is the extinction of night. There is the extinction of darkness. We live in an age where not only has darkness been overtaken by light during our nocturnal life, not only in big cities, but globally, it's more and more difficult to experience night as it used to be. But in fact, what is it? I don't know if it's 20,000 or 40,000 satellites are about to be launched to the atmosphere, around the planet, across the atmosphere into other, like, closer outer space, to make sure that the digital, the empire, the digital is never loses a single spot. It's continuous. So you have this massive noise producing machine, which is of course profoundly deafening and profoundly blinding. So the question is, how could you produce an apparatus that counters this in a way that is feasible and that is not counterproductive in that it just produces different noise? Now, this is obviously a very it's not just any question, but that is the reason, why we might think a machine of this sort is necessary. And why I think it is important for critique and for deconstruction to be aware of its instituting capacity, and not only of its capacity to take steps back. Because usually critique isn't very, only embarks on enterprises or initiatives very sort of with a sense of guilt, because, well, it's too bad, we simply have to do this, but we prefer not to. And I think that is unsustainable ethically and theoretically and practically. And I think it's very important to work to clarify that. So the building, the positive sort of building of such a machine, as I have thought to be doing over these 20 years with the Institute, is, I obviously think it's important and worth it and possible. It's for others to judge whether, in fact, it actually makes sense, or it sticks to its own logic and its own ethics. But that would be the relation between this instituting vein and the science producing machinery in the first place.
Just a small clarification in all of them. So you say that the central to the practice then is a kind of ethics of listening as the
yeah,
yes,
absolutely,
yeah,
which really refers back to the psychoanalytic element of play, whereby without that there's just nothing left. And in fact, the analyst is not a person, but is essentially a listening function that then allows for a whole scene to sort of become deployed. And I suppose what's at stake here is the question whether it's possible to do that in a properly social dimension, and not simply in a singularly personal dimension, which is of course a classic locus of discussion. And thus the importance of recovering theoretically the very possibility of thinking of these things in terms of social bonds, and not simply in terms, for example, of experiences or of meetings or rather sort of clumsy notions of the sort. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I just want to say thank you, first of all. This is very inspiring to hear your story, but I wanted to ask you more about the atheological aspect of the Institute. Because when you discussed it, you talked about it in nature, as the nature of creating the community in a sustainable way for the Institute. And you said that meant to establish it without religion, politics, science, or art. And personally, as I've worked with Mark talking about atheology, the thing that has become God that isn't God is art. And I don't know if that like inclusion through exclusion and in that way with the art that you're making through the institution is intentional, or like what you see as atheological in the institution itself. Yeah, I'm just curious as to what.
No, that's a very interesting and important point. And it's not the first, and it won't be the last time to come up. Clearly, art has an absolutely central role to play in all of this. You've seen it through the many examples. We could multiply them. And for example, with Beatriz, we have worked very much to promote artistic production among the quote-unquote disabled. We always put that word between scare quotes, to be able to take a conceptual distance from the very idea of disability, but at the same time, so as not to lose the legal advances that have been made in the name of disability. I just wanted to clarify that. So I think the presence of art and its importance is absolutely undoubtable. At the same time, and this is a psychoanalytic, a particularly psychoanalytic sort of perspective to take, we would want to distinguish in this context between the artistic and the order of the aesthetic experience from what I might call the purely critical or the purely analytical, or even the purely infrapolitical, which are the three discourses that set off from the residual and not from power, knowledge, or, as in the case of art, the subjective. So from this perspective, the artistic can also be thought as a social bond, which I think is interesting and important for our artistic work, for artists, and for thought that is related to art and the aesthetic. But there is a clear difference there to be also sort of acknowledged, which is very clear from a clinical perspective when we affirm that the psychoanalyst cannot be a poet. The clinical moment of the analyst is not an aesthetic moment. Because if it were an aesthetic moment, one might be carried away by a certain aesthetic logic, and which might be clinically sort of undesired, right? So I would therefore want to bring that back and say that in fact it is important for, let us say, ethics not to be aesthetics. That is, in the same way that it's important for politics not to be aesthetics, for many reasons, and there's a long, of course, quite chilling story behind that. So what I want to say about the deconstructed bond is that in fact, it is very closely related to art. It can dialogue with artistic milieus very profoundly and very intensely, but it cannot be reduced to an artistic sort of gesture or activity. And I would say that the same goes for the atheological, which would be in the terrain of, and here we run into problems immediately, don't we, of the spiritual, of the religious, of the transcendental. I mean, what are we going to do? How are we going to call this thing? But in that domain, the atheological, I think, has to be thought in terms that are non-aesthetic in its purest form, or its most proper form is rather what I want to say. So it would be a very interesting discussion to have. We're already having it. I think it's a well worth discussion to sort of continue. But I wonder if I'm clear enough about the reasons why to fall back into a theology as aesthetics from this perspective would be to risk reducing the wealth and the breadth of the four domains, or the four main and original possibilities, reduce them to only three. So in fact, I would say a theology reduced to aesthetics is not taking into account psychoanalysis. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Let's see what Mark says.
Thanks, Brandon, for your your explanation on detail about how the institute works. Is fascinating project. Like to hear that. I have a lot of questions. I wanted to maybe you could expand more. I was very surprised to find the theme of autonomy like being posed, although it's kind of obvious if you think about the institute that's trying to constitute like an autonomous or thinking, and how you kind of pose it in an ethical way, as you said at the end of your talk. I think that's a very interesting, not only reflection but act that you have account for it made of the institute itself. Also want to I was surprised to see that the time of the emergency of the writing machine is like contemporary to like the golden age of bloggers, like the golden age of writing in the internet. And it made me thought of like the value of the love letter for Lacan. I've been always been a little bit skeptical to the supremacy of the written word in the project, but I thought that maybe you had something to say about that, and also, yeah, I don't know. And finally, about this declination of Derrida's like this absent what's it called, like radical free speech as a declination of like free association. As you know, like Freud said, like free speech is of course like a trap, because the subject, when it comes to now, is kind of saying everything with like repression and all that. So what would be like this repression point, or like still that you have found in the past, or like try to open this discursive space that you work so hard for?
Okay, great. It's curious, when we started, we didn't have not even blogs, no Skype, only email and asynchronous forums. And then, of course, came this explosion that you do well to remind us of, the blogs. And the typing machine, or the máquina de escribir, was a very deliberate gesture that is, I think, very context specific. Academically, I usually say it has three registers. Like the first register is academic, and it has to do with the sort of reconstruction of the experience of the classic essay writing academic system, which I was extremely impressed by. And I was very impressed by it because experiencing it in the UK, I realized that it was completely lacking in Mexico, at least, and I think generally in Latin America. There is no school essay writing tradition in our countries. It doesn't mean that it's doing incredibly great in French or in German or in English, but there is a tradition there. So what is this oral school culture that we come from? There's something there that bugs me, or that interrogates me, because of course we know there's a very close relation between essay writing, and the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment then is connected to all sorts of other things. So the immediate effects that you have in our countries is that the word of the teacher is usually the word of authority. So teachers carry more authority than books have. They carry so much authority that they even write the jokes that they will say every course once they get to class number 18. And they will do exams on what they themselves said. So therefore you live in this very strange, if you look at it from afar, context where there aren't libraries. So there's this whole question of authority, of transference, of power that is linked to this sort of oral school tradition. So I wanted to disrupt that. And of course, a couple of friends said, you know, you're absolutely mad. People don't write in this culture, which is really quite true, except there is a constant, very important group, and it's not necessarily linked to class only, although of course it's a heavy factor, of people who actually are very invested in writing, even for quite personal reasons. The second claim is to do with a certain way of literalizing Derridian écriture under the form of this day-to-day writing. And even though we know that écriture is not reducible to writing in the bookish sense, in fact, it's incredibly productive to get people to deal with form at the very same time they need to deal with context. So the point is not only to hand in their work in written form, but to promote a style of seminar where you have the participants work on the form of what they say as much as on what they're saying and why they're saying it. That is why our final projects, our doctoral thesis and so on, they format-wise, they're completely open. You can hand in a project which is sort of, my God, I'm going to turn to that awful example of Twitter based, or you can do a scenic artistic project or people have done films and all sorts, and it's quite challenging. I mean, it's easier said than done, but the point is really not to insist on writing to become a sort of academician of writing as such, even though it's quite important, but to promote writing as a form of symbolic sort of production again, but not only, again, not in terms only of what it said, but how it's said. For example, this is quite interesting, like lights turning on and off. I mean, it's a whole different effect, right?
It has its thing. It has its thing.
Okay, and the third effect, the third level is psychoanalytic, and it's quite clearly para-analytic to establish a relation of distance with your own voice and separating person and author over a prolonged period of, say, 2 years at master's level and so on, or even a bit longer, 2-3 years. Anyway, I mean, there's more, but that I think that I think would give you an idea. Now, of course, free association is ironically not free at all. But you don't know how much of a mess you're in unless you allow yourself to follow the trail of what is called free association, like far enough. So I think that's what's so interesting about, and personally, and I think institutionally, we try to say, okay, so you're interested, in some outrageous subjects, very unusual. We are very happy when people come to us and say, I've been wanting to work on, X and Y, and they kicked me out from this university because I wanted to work on this, and it happens quite often. So we say, okay, fine, we have no problem with this. But and this reminds me of something Chomsky once said: things are interesting if they're taken far enough. In fact, they're only interesting if they're taken far enough. So, okay, you want to work on pornography? Fine, just take it far enough. You want to work on, you name it. So I think what the clue to this free speech, that by the way is not a syntax that Derrida uses in the University Without Condition, but the unconditionality in fact leads to the making visible of all the conditions that are, of course, regulating anything and everything. And then you still have the privilege of, once you know how very much you are sort of stuck to all these conditions. Yeah. Even then, you will be able to find the missing tile in order to move. And this is also clinical moment where the determination of the social, the economic, the political, yeah, it's massive. We know it's not so easy to get a sense of its density, but once you do, then there's also something always missing, which will give you the margin necessary to move and to be able to take a step to the side or whatever. So really, it's about to talk about this unconditionality. In a way, it's a seductive gesture, right? It's like, yeah, you can come talk about anything, just like the analyst does, but let's take this far enough to see, where you really are with it, or where we all are with this, and then be in a position to take a decision later on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm trying to into this question. So I don't know if it's going to work out in a short time, and I don't know if I'm going to open a whole other can of worms, but I did want to perhaps hear you speak more about the place of nation in this whole enterprise. And I mean, arguably, perhaps there are few countries and national contexts where the intellectual project has been as devoted to the question of the nation, or what is exactly, and the failure of the nation, and the place of the nation, and how the community is created as Mexico, and Colombia is obviously also devoted to that project. And I guess there's an argument to be made that one of the big issues, like the crisis of Mexico in the contemporary context, is not only a crisis of violence and the violence of the state, but also a crisis of the nation and its representation, not of like the Mexican flag or like not nacionalidad rancia, but rather like community and the failing and disintegrating sense of community. So I was wondering if there is any, like, if this is also in a way, I mean, it's fitting enough that there it says forma parte de la comunidad, if this is a way to think about community after the nation or beyond the nation, and how that yet interacts with the very particular national context of Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a way of thinking about the social beyond the collapse of all our previous unworkable sort of formulas. It reminds me of something that we did in relation to Illich's book in the vineyard of the text. The question is whether there is such a thing as a community that can be sustained by electronic writing, and he says there isn't. And this is something of a laboratory to say there is, or there is under such and such conditions. So our position on that is absolutely not nationalistic, as you can imagine. In fact, we only respond to, I mean, initially the Spanish language, we might say language in general, as the last and the first, perhaps the last nation that we can belong to. And therefore, we've never considered ourselves to be neither Mexico City based nor even Mexican centered. We've always sort of ourselves in this cosmopolitan, much more sort of, and the effects of that are quite interesting. One could, of course, talk long about those, but you're absolutely right to point that out. Yeah.
I don't know, what the question?
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, friends, for your patience over Zoom. So Alberto Moreiras, hello, Alberto, says Benjamin as a dispositif, as you told us, 17 orients itself around deconstruction as a social bond in an instituting way. I think that must be connected to the notion of an archithought, yes. Now, it is difficult to see any possibility of an instituting an archithought today. That is against the background of climate collapse and the potential end of the world, quote unquote, which at the very least means the end of a certain civilizational project. How can 17 reconcile an anarchic approach with a massive need for what some analysts of climate collapse have called the planetary thinking, which allegedly implies the creation that is the institution of new forms of universality? I understand that is a question about a possibly new status of both the master discourse and university discourse when confronted with the rising of a new historical epoch, which is not what has been called the Anthropocene, but precisely the absolute demand of something like a counter-Anthropocene. Okay, a massive and very important question indeed. Thank you very much for it. I don't. Okay, my own attempt has always been to derive the possibility of an instituting moment, moment that is derived from the anarchic. That is the whole point. And I mean, my own thought about this might be less robust, but if we take a cue from psychoanalytic discourse as it's written out by Lacan, indeed you have the possibility of producing a signifier at the end of a process that is in principle that of an analysis that is in principle in and of itself and archic. So I would say I would want to believe that the only way that you can get to a form of universality which can take stock of that collapse that you are correctly underlining is if you have the sort of institutional vessels that are able to somehow hold things together for that conversation to even take place in the first place. we know how frustrating it has been for the scientists who are watching climate chaos sort of happen in like live, like how hard they have found it to make their message known in the media, in universities, of course, in political circles and international organizations and so on. So maybe it is precisely because these other dispositives are so limiting and are so allergic to the anarchic as such. So I would want to think that the Institute as a pilot experience in this deconstruction social bond idea that is instituting and not only subject producing, would have the ability to hold the conversation and sustain it for it to be able to happen as it needs to happen, you know, taking into account the hard truths that need to be listened to. So I think you pose a problem that is precisely the kind of question that I'm trying to address when proposing this as a dispositive. And I think the only way to know whether this is possible or not is actually to put it into practice. And in that sense, I would invite you to, you know, to proceed and you know, and see what happens, sort of thing. So thank you for following so closely the grain of the proposal, and of course there's more to say, but that would be my general response. Is there anything? Okay, so it's been quite a long conversation already. If anyone else is tempted to make a comment or ask a question at this time over Zoom, please do. If not, we can, of course, come in touch afterwards. But now's the time to do so if you feel like it. Or indeed, any of you are welcome to as well.
Here we'll be able to adjourn to have a drink once the Zoom. That's something that cannot be done virtually quite yet. So I think that if there are any further questions or remarks from Zoom, now would be the time. Then I think our discussion here can continue over there with with a glass of wine in hand.
Super. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so very much, all of you, online and off. And thank you.
Thank you. This is a really brilliant and extremely interesting, provocative discussion. So thank you, Benjamin Mayer. Thank you all. And those of us who are here in body and soul and not just in soul can continue the discussion at the end.
There's one question.
Yeah.
There's one more question.
George Hughes.
Okay. Thanks, George. You've discussed 17 via aesthetic, theological, ethical, and critical dimensions. We could, of course, add pedagogical, epistemological, scientific, and others. How do you think your practice might look differently from a decolonial perspective, in which many of these dimensions are not easily detached from each other? I am thinking of looking at these issues from James Brittle's ways of being. Okay, thank you, George. This is a very provocative point, important. I think it talks about a definite shift in the general intellectual climate that we've observed over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. And I wouldn't say I have the full answers with me. I know my presentation might come across as quite classical in some of its idioms and references, if one takes into account the sorts of positions and perspectives that you mentioned. I think really the first, I mean, to be sort of rigorous about it, I think one would have to revise what exactly it is that you are alluding to under the name of this decolonial position. I do not know the work of the author you mentioned, so I'm sort of without that possibility of taking it into account at this time. But I think there are many. I don't think there's anything particularly dependent on the part of our initiative on this partition, which is classically sort of which take these classical categories of epistemology and so on, very Western and very canonical in different ways. So I would say that the accent that we've traditionally put on practice and even on praxis, not only psychoanalytic, by the way, also in the field of disability, health, things to do with architecture, building, and so on and so forth, working with children, or even, I mean, this sort of constant accent on pragma in our context, I think already has the virtue of questioning the sorts of categories that we use to describe things and to orient ourselves. So I would want to insist that, in fact, the appeal you're making isn't essentially different from the confrontation that practice as such always produces with regard to any theoretical construct in general, by the way, the decolonial one as well. When you actually are in the field and are occupying yourself with particular issues at one time. So, in other words, I would want to have a very close look at what you are understanding by the decolonial here, what its assumptions are. It often turns out that the assumptions are in fact very ancient ones and often pre-critical ones, if we take into account many of the kinds of references that we work with. But the other question, in terms of sort of putting Humpty Dumpty together again in this integral way that things take place and happen, be it climate collapse or health or psychic malaise or whatever, I think it's quite clear, and there's no difficulty in approaching that sort of messy integral substance that manifests itself in practice through this general dispositif that I've been trying to describe. So I don't know if that responds to your question, or if you feel I've understood it, but that would be what I would be able to say at this time, and I'd be delighted to talk more about that. Okay, so Alberto has added one perhaps insufficient thing to say, is that any possible articulation of a counter Anthropocene would have to be decolonial in a radical sense. Okay, so that would be sufficient. So Alberto has jumped into the discussion with that, George. And then you respond, what you just said now about practice sounds right, okay, great. The decolonial assumptions are not Mignolean. They have more to do with practice in the way you just articulated. Great. I'm very happy about that because I do think that practice is something that has been completely sidelined traditionally in universities, quite paradoxically. And I'm very committed to thinking and operating in ways that bring this scene of practice and praxis back into, you know, the main sort of focus of activity.
I think that.
Okay, so thank you very
Thank you
much.
so
indeed.
much, everyone. So.
Thank you so very much.